So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your interim host for this episode, Karl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name, and today we're talking about 10 maritime disasters that aren't the Titanic. And as with all the videos here on TopTenz, this one is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That member today being me. So I wrote it, I researched it, I edited it, and I'm recording the video. Check me out. Also, we do have people behind the scenes, like people who edit these videos. Say hi to them, because these videos are a team effort, even though I didn't make it sound like it just then. I'm sorry, let's quickly move on. Everybody knows the story of the RMS Titanic and how in 1912 it hit an iceberg and then over the course of several terrifying hours tore itself apart and sank to the icy depths, taking some 1,500 souls with it. But this is far from the only and rather sadly far from the worst maritime disaster in history. So our analytics tell us that videos like this do quite well, so thanks to all the true crime aficionados out there for that one. Let's take a look at some of the others, shall we? And just a few notes here. This isn't a subject matter I'm particularly comfortable writing, researching, or talking about. But as mentioned, our analytics say it does quite well, so I will try to maintain a more somber, respectful tone than I ordinarily would do in my own content, or indeed other videos on the channel. Number 10, the ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. The date of sinking, 1945. So, right off the bat, that decidedly German-sounding name and that date is probably raising a few eyebrows at home. So I should clarify that yes, this was a Nazi cruise liner. Specifically, it was the Nazi cruise liner being built to initially just promote all things Nazi. With it being reported that before settling on the name, the Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi bigwig who was assassinated in Switzerland by a student for being, a Nazi, the name for the boat was going to be, quite simply, the Adolf Hitler. Also, our analytics say that stuff about World War II and Nazis does quite well in the algorithm, so we thought we'd cover all of our bases. So anyway, during the war, this ship was repurposed as a transport ship for refugees and the like, with the Germans slapping a few anti-aircraft guns on it for defence. But at the end of the day, this was still like a regular boat with minimal defensive capabilities and the top speed of we'll get there when we get there, which, rather unfortunately for the 10,000 or so people aboard the ship in February of 1945, made it a comically easy target for a passing Soviet sub that spied it fleeing Eastern Europe. 3 torpedoes is all it took to send the former pride of the Third Reich's propaganda efforts to the depths, along with an estimated 9,600 people, making this the single largest loss of life in maritime history. A fact that was largely overlooked, given that it happened at the end of a war that had claimed the lives of millions. Moving on, number 9, the ship, the RMS Lusitania. The date of sinking, 1915. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania is a curious moment in world history, as despite it being a British ship, primarily carrying British passengers, that sank in British waters, it was one of several events that ultimately led to the US entering the First World War. This is because the ship was also carrying some 128 American passengers when it sank, including a member of the famed Vanderbilt business empire, Alfred Guiney Vanderbilt, and noted American author, Elbert Hubbard. For the morbidly curious, the disaster also claimed a further 1,200 lives. The sinking of the ship by a German U-boat in 1915 caused widespread controversy and led to near universal condemnation by other world powers, since the ship was a cruise liner and posed no real threat to anybody. And it was deemed that this broke what's colloquially known as cruiser rules, basically an informal set of rules decided upon during wartime that most everyone kind of sort of agreed to, that they wouldn't fire upon unarmed or neutral ships, with the expectation that any ship they did fire upon that met this criteria would be given sufficient time for the people aboard to flee, escape, or be escorted to nearby land if the ships and the lifeboats and stuff they had aboard to escape weren't sufficient. The problem is that the Germans didn't think that these rules applied to submarines, because they weren't boats and would frequently fire upon other ships without warning, which is what happened with the Lusitania and led to what's been diplomatically described as a loosening of the rules of engagement throughout the war, which in turn led to the disasters like the one mentioned in the previous entry. Moving on, the ship, the SS Andrea Doria, when it sank, 1956. Okay, so it's probably going to go without saying that this list is dark and concerns a lot of stories of people dying in perhaps the most terrifying manner possible, being dragged to the bottom of the ocean by the pull of a sinking iron behemoth, your last screams of fear and anguish being from lungs crushed by the immense pressures of the deep. If people can't tell, I'm scared of the water. Yeah. So let's talk about a time where almost everybody aboard one of these ships survived. If only because I wouldn't be able to make it through the script if we didn't. So, occurring in 1956, the sinking of the SS Andrea Doria, an Italian ocean line, is a story that showcases just how important it is to have people in charge who know exactly what the hell they're doing and how it can literally mean the difference between life and death. After colliding with another ship, the MS Stockholm, Captain Calamite and his Swedish counterpart, Captain Gunnar Nordenson, sprung into action, with the former focusing on getting as many passengers as possible off the ship, and the latter, after confirming that his ship was damaged but in no immediate danger of sinking, on reassuring his crew and passengers to focus on rescue efforts. In addition, several other ships, including one that transported fruit of all things, made a beeline for the accident as soon as they were made aware of it via radio transmissions. All in all, some 1,660 people of the recorded 1,706 aboard survived this ordeal, and the Stockholm even managed to make it to port under its own power, carrying more than its fair share of passengers, with the unlucky few who remained being dragged below the waves alongside the wreckage of the ship. Number 7. The ship, the Sultana. When it sank, 1865. So, one thing you will notice and become increasingly frustrated and angered by, I certainly know that I was while researching the topic of maritime disasters, is just how preventable so many of them are. For example, the tragic loss of life caused by the sinking of the Titanic could have been greatly mitigated by simply outfitting the ship with more lifeboats. And for anyone who's unaware, the Titanic had 20 when it launched, though this itself was more than it legally had to carry, with the legal minimum being 16. Even then, these 20 lifeboats would have only allowed the ship to rescue roughly half of a full complement of passengers if every single one was filled. Yeah, stuff like that is incredibly frustrating to read and learn about. Which brings us to the Sultana disaster, an event that claimed some 1,100 lives and was directly caused by simple human greed. To explain, the Sultana, a steamer, was one of several vessels contracted to move Union prisoners of war down the Mississippi River, with the government offering between $2 and $10, the amount depended on the rank of the POW, for every person a given vessel could relocate. One Captain James Mason liked the sound of this and worked with a guy called Reuben Hatch to cram as many men as possible into the Sultana in the hopes of a sweet, sweet payday for them both. There were some kickbacks involved. In the end, the Sultana, which had a capacity of about 400 people at most, ended up carrying in excess of 2,000 men, which it maybe could have done at a push if not for another effort by Mason to save money, paying an engineer to patch a faulty boiler instead of repairing it. The end result was, predictably, disaster. A few hours after setting off, 3 of the steamer's boilers detonated, sending hundreds of passengers, many of whom were emaciated POWs, remember, into the water as the rest burned to death in the sinking wreckage. And perhaps the most frustrating part about this story is that nobody was ever really held accountable. Okay, Mason died in the fire, so that's a sort of karmic justice, I guess, but the disaster was largely forgotten and overlooked because it occurred one day after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Moving on. Number 6. The ship, the RMS Empress of Ireland. When it sank, 1914. So remember how I talked about just then how a lot of these disasters are preventable, or that the loss of life could have been curtailed if the people in charge gave slightly more of a shit about safeguarding human life than they did profits? Well, even in cases where this does happen, disaster can still occur, as is the sad case of the RMS Empress of Ireland. Occurring just 2 years after the sinking of the Titanic, the ship was positively lazy with lifeboats, carrying so many that an entire ship's complement of passengers could be rescued, in addition to several hundred more if the ship got into trouble. But here's the thing about lifeboats. They're only really useful if you can actually, get to them, and when the Empress of Ireland collided with the Norwegian cargo vessel the Storstad, it sank so quickly that even if it had 100 lifeboats, there wasn't really anything anybody on board could do. All in all, the ship sunk in just 15 minutes, as in it took 15 minutes after this thing was hit for the entire thing to be underneath the waves. And when the ship eventually sunk below the waves, there were reportedly hundreds of people taking shelter on the capsized side, and when it flipped up, those hundreds of people were flowing into the frigid waters where they drowned, while the hundreds or so people were still stuck on the boat were dragged below the waves. Nothing anybody could really do. And as an idea of how fast this all went down, it is believed that many of the victims inside of the ship died before they even know anything had happened. It just happened that fast. Which again is why I'm scared of the water. Thank you for making me do this one, you guys. It's real doing great for my anxiety. Number 5. The ship, the MS Herald of Free Enterprise, when it sank in 1987. Something that's often left out of dramatisations of disasters like the ones we're discussing today is just how quickly things can go terribly, horribly wrong. Like the previous thing we talked about, the whole ship sank in just 15 minutes, and it's understandable that this is the case. It's hard to imagine something as big as a ship or ferry disappearing beneath the waves in minutes, let alone seconds. But, and as we're about to discuss, it can happen even faster for that, and in those cases, all anybody can really do is just hope for the best. This was the case with the Herald of Free Enterprise, a British ferry that routinely, ferry people between Dover and Calais. As a result of human error, which saw the ferry's bow door being left wide open, the moment the ferry got into open water after leaving the Bruges seaport, thousands of gallons of water rushed in through an opening, causing it to capsize and sink within 90 seconds. But it gets worse, because remember this was a ferry, so people were in their cars and stuff, and if you're anything like me, you probably spend a lot of time thinking about how being on a sinking ship could possibly be worse, and the answer to that is, imagine being in a car crash that also happens to be aboard a sinking ship. As you might expect, immediately after the disaster, safety protocols for ferries were overhauled, but it was too little too late for the 193 people whose lives were lost in the accident, because, yeah, this thing was ruled an accident because a guy, and I cannot stress this enough, left a door open on a boat. Moving on, number 4, the ship, the MV Doña Paz, when it sank, 1987. So you know when you get on a plane and they immediately hand you a safety card and they tell you on this card that there's a life vest directly below your seat and that you should be aware of exactly how it works in the highly unlikely event that the plane you are in falls into the ocean? Have you ever found yourself thinking about how that seems a little extreme given that you got to spend the next several hours in the sky? Well, with that in mind, you probably assume that the safety standards on a ship or a boat are far more stringent in regards to, what to do if you end up in the water. As we're hoping this video shows, this isn't always the case and often has tragic consequences. Just consider the case of the MV Doña Paz, widely considered the single deadliest peacetime maritime disaster, with virtually everybody on board perishing. Contributing factors to this were numerous, but were mostly caused by ignoring basic safety protocols. For starters, the ship was dangerously over capacity. It was reportedly carrying some 2,000 more people than it was supposed to, and there was a bunch of people not on the original manifest due to a habit of just selling more tickets than the ship had to make more money. It was also deemed unseaworthy before setting sail. It had no license, had an unqualified crew. Hell, they didn't even have a guy just, keeping watch so they didn't hit anything, which is how the Doña Paz hit an oil tanker. An oil tanker. When the crash happened, the ship was similarly unprepared. Most of the crew were drunk or just watching TV, and the captain was in the middle of a movie, and all the life vests had been inexplicably locked away below deck. I don't like boats. Moving on, number 3, the ship, the MTS Oceanus. When it sank, 1991. It's often said that the true test of a person's character is when their life or the life of another is on the line, and then do we get a glimpse into the character of their soul. Some step up, go above and beyond, throwing themselves onto the metaphorical hand grenade life just tossed into the room. Some do not. The sinking of the Oceanus is an example of both. We say this because when the ship ran into trouble and began taking on water, the captain, Yanis Avranas, immediately, heroically, and with no regard for his own safety, noped out and abandoned the entire ship along with a bunch of the crew. Fortunately for literally everybody else on board, this is a rare example of everybody aboard one of these ships surviving. Zimbabwean guitarist Most Hills recognised that maybe something was amiss, his first clue reportedly being that he saw a waiter drop a plate, which made him worry, as even in the roughest seas, that really doesn't happen. Trusting his gut, Hills explored the guts of the ship with, I'm not making this up, a magician, and discovered that they'd taken on water. Rushing back to the main deck, Hills and a ragtag group comprised of basically the ship's entertainment, including his own wife and, remember, a magician, some waiters, and some people who work for the cruise line. Not people who worked for the ship, but the cruise line who booked holidays and stuff. So they didn't even know what was going on. What they began doing is loading lifeboats full of passengers as the whole ship listed further to the side. For the curious, Hills had no idea how to do this, and during the whole ordeal, no official order to evacuate was ever given. Also, it happened at night, in the dark. Eventually, he realised that they needed anything in the way of actual instruction from somebody who knew what they were doing, and he rushed to the bridge and found it empty. Remember, the captain had just ran away. Thinking quickly, he grabbed the nearest thing like a phone and began screaming the word Mayday into it. Eventually, he got a response from a confused official who queried his rank, to which he responded, and I'm not making this up, guitarist. Long story short, everybody aboard was rescued, and Hills later went on to be a cruise director, because why wouldn't he? Captain Avranas, meanwhile, was found guilty of negligence and punished by being given command of another vessel by the same cruise line. I'm not making that up either. Number 2. The ship, the PS General Slocum, when it sank, 1904. Throughout this list, we've covered a number of record-breaking accidents and disasters which are certainly edifying and interesting, but there's something to be said about the forgotten disasters of history. The unthinkable loss of life that are simply just not talked about because they were eclipsed by even greater ones. A criteria I think applies to the sinking of the PS General Slocum. For example, consider that the sinking of the Slocum was considered to be, at the time, and to quote, the worst maritime disaster of the 20th century. A grim record it held until the sinking of the Titanic a few years later, basically erasing the disaster from common knowledge. As it occurred after the aforementioned Sultana disaster, which itself was largely forgotten if you recall, it was only considered to be the second worst maritime disaster in US history, which also saw it being forgotten and overlooked. Hell, even within the area in which it occurred, New York, the disaster's record for largest loss of life as a result of a man-made disaster was taken over by the 9/11 attacks. And to be clear, I'm not downplaying the loss of life here, it's quite the opposite, and I find it kind of tragic that such a massive event in history has been largely overshadowed and left to the wayside. Even in this entry, we felt compelled to clarify that it's the second worst maritime disaster in US history, because that's literally how every source describes it, usually spending just as much time describing and talking about the Sultana as they do the Slocum, something I now realise I've gone and done as well. History often repeats itself. And finally, number 1. The ship, the MS Estonia. When it sank, 1994. Perhaps the scariest thing about all of these stories, at least for me while I was researching and writing this, is that when ships sink below the waves, owing to the nature of how, that goes down, it's near impossible to know exactly for sure what went on, since, in many of the cases, the evidence is thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean, and everybody with first-hand knowledge is often lost to the waves. Such is the case for the MS Estonia, one of the worst losses of life since the Titanic, where even to this day, exactly how a ship with almost 1,000 people aboard just up and sank, killing all but a few dozen of them. This is heavily debated, with much of the controversy about how it all went down stemming from eyewitness accounts directly contradicting an initial official report. Specifically, near every survivor of the disaster reported hearing a massive, and I quote, metallic bang prior to the sinking concurrent with an explosion or collision of some kind, which contradicted an initial report claiming rough seas literally tore the ship apart, causing it to flood and sink. Then in 2020, someone sent a drone down to the bottom of the sea and recorded a massive hole in the side of the wreck, not concurrent with the damage described in that initial report, which prompted another investigation and then another, all while conspiracy theories raged and the families of victims became increasingly frustrated and annoyed. Even to this day, as mentioned, this is a hotly debated topic and no one really knows what went on, which is, to me, an oft overlooked aspect of stories like this, that for the victims and their families, they often don't get answers, only questions, and the stories don't have satisfying conclusions, they just end. So I hope this was a video that was educational and entertaining. Entertaining is probably not the right word, but I hope it's a video people enjoyed. Researching, writing and recording it was a little tough for me, as was probably evident, but our analytics do show that people, they do have a morbid sense of curiosity. I do have one myself, just not in regards to this particular topic, because I'm scared of the open water. But if you have enjoyed this video, you can like, you can comment, you can subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you for watching. I've been your host, Karl Smallwood, and just go out there and have the best day that you can.